Rain poured over Seattle, a steady hum against the windows of the Rainy Haven, a small bar tucked in the heart of the city. Ava Bennett stood behind the counter, her hands moving with quiet precision as she wiped down a glass. At 24, she was a dreamer trapped in a simple life, pouring drinks for strangers while her heart whispered of something more. The bar was her sanctuary, a place where the world slowed down, where she could listen to the stories of lonely travelers and tired souls. Tonight, though, it was nearly empty, the rain keeping most people away. Only the soft jazz from the old radio filled the air, mingling with the sound of water outside. Ava glanced at the clock. 11:30. Her shift would end soon and she'd walk home through the wet streets, her umbrella barely shielding her from the downpour. She didn't mind the rain. It felt like a friend, a constant in her unpredictable days. She brushed a strand of dark hair from her face and sighed, wondering if this was all her life would ever be, serving whiskey and small talk to people who forgot her name by morning. But then the door creaked open, and everything changed. A man stepped inside, his hoodie soaked, droplets falling to the wooden floor. He looked out of place, not like the usual crowd of dock workers or late-night wanderers. He pulled the hood back, revealing sharp features and gray eyes that caught the dim light. Ava's breath hitched. There was something about him, a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller. He walked to the bar and sat down, his voice low as he ordered a bourbon, neat. She poured it, her hands steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. They started talking, small things at first, the weather, the emptiness of the night. His name was Gray, or so he said, short for Grayson maybe, though he didn't elaborate. He had a way of speaking that pulled her in, soft but deliberate, like he was choosing every word with care. She told him about her job, how she'd ended up here after dropping out of art school, how she still sketched in her free time. He listened, really listened, his gaze locked on hers, and for the first time in a long time, Ava felt seen. The conversation flowed like the rain outside, effortless and endless. One drink turned into 2, then 3, and soon they were laughing, the kind of laughter that felt reckless and free. Gray stood, offering his hand with a crooked smile, asking her to dance. There was no dance floor, just the narrow space between the bar and the tables, but she took his hand anyway. The jazz swelled and they moved together, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. It was foolish, she knew, dancing with a stranger in an empty bar. But it felt right. She looked up at him, their faces close, and time seemed to stop. His eyes held a storm of their own, a mix of longing and something deeper, something she couldn't name. Then he kissed her, slow and warm, tasting of bourbon and rain. Her heart pounded, a voice in her head screaming to pull away, but her body leaned in, melting into him. It was a kiss that felt like a beginning, like the universe had tilted just for them. Ava didn't know who he was, not really. She didn't know that Grayson Sullivan was hiding from a life of boardrooms and power, that he was the CEO of Sullivan Tech, drowning his stress in a bar far from his penthouse. All she knew was the way he held her, the way his touch set her skin on fire, and as they stood there swaying to the music, she thought to herself, I've been waiting for this, for him, without even knowing it. His voice was soft, like the rain outside, but his eyes, they burned right through me. I didn't know him, but I felt like I'd been waiting for him my whole life. That night, under the dim lights of the Rainy Haven, Ava Bennett met the man who would unravel her world, one heartbeat at a time. The jazz faded into a distant hum as Ava Bennett stood in the empty bar, her hand still warm from Grayson Sullivan's touch. The Rainy Haven felt smaller now, the air thick with something unspoken. Gray leaned against the bar, his gray eyes locked on hers, a quiet challenge in his gaze. She should have sent him away, closed up for the night, and gone home to her tiny apartment. But the bourbon had softened her edges and his presence pulled at her like a tide she couldn't fight. One more drink, she told herself. Just one more. He poured this time, sliding the glass across the counter with a grin that made her stomach flip. They clinked their drinks together, the sound sharp in the stillness and sipped in silence. The alcohol burned her throat, loosening the knots in her chest, and soon they were talking again, words spilling out like they'd known each other for years. He asked about her dreams, the ones she'd buried after art school, and she found herself telling him things she hadn't said aloud in forever, how she wanted to paint the world, to capture its beauty on canvas. He listened, his head tilted, a faint smile playing on his lips. The clock ticked past midnight, but neither of them cared. Gray stood again, his hand outstretched, and this time she didn't hesitate. They danced closer now, his breath warm against her cheek, her fingers curling into his damp hoodie. The rain pounded harder outside, a steady rhythm that matched her racing pulse. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly his lips were on hers again, fiercer this time, hungry and unyielding. Her hands slid up his chest, pulling him closer, and for a moment, nothing else existed, just the heat of him, the taste of him, the way he made her feel alive. We shouldn't, she thought, but the words dissolved as he whispered her name. Ava, like it was a prayer. He took her hand, leading her out into the rain, the cold water soaking through her clothes as they stumbled down the street. A neon sign flickered ahead. The Driftwood Inn, a cheap little hotel she'd passed 100 times but never noticed until now. They didn't speak as they crossed the lobby, the night clerk barely glancing up from his magazine. In the elevator, he pressed her against the wall, kissing her until she couldn't breathe, and she let him, wanted him, needed him in a way that scared her. The room was small, the bed creaking under their weight as they fell into it. Her shirt hit the floor, then his, and the world blurred into a haze of touch and sound. She'd never done this before, never given herself to anyone, and a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. But Gray's hands were gentle, his voice soft as he asked if she was sure. She nodded, pulling him down, and in that moment she let go of everything. Her fears, her rules, her past. It was reckless, wild, a storm of passion that swept her away. She gave herself to him completely, her body trembling as they moved together, the rain a distant roar beyond the window. When it was over, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing circles on her back. She felt raw, exposed, but safe somehow, like he'd caught her when she didn't even know she was falling. She drifted off, lulled by the steady beat of his heart, thinking this might be the start of something real. But when she woke, the bed was cold. Gray was gone. On the pillow sat a scrap of paper, scribbled in black ink. Thank you for last night, G. That was it. No number, no promise. Just 5 words that cut deeper than she expected. Ava sat up, the ache between her legs a quiet reminder of what she'd done. She pulled the sheet around her, staring at the note, her mind spinning. Who was he? Why had he left? She replayed the night, every kiss, every touch, searching for a clue, but all she had was a name, Gray, and a memory that wouldn't let her go. I gave myself to a shadow, a man without a name, she thought. Was it a mistake, or was it the first time I truly felt alive? Her hands shook as she dressed, the weight of it settling in. She'd lost something precious, but she'd gained something too, a feeling she couldn't name. Meanwhile, across town, Grayson Sullivan sat in his sleek office atop Sullivan Tech, his phone buzzing with urgent messages. He hadn't wanted to leave her, not like that, not after what they'd shared, but the call had come at dawn, his assistant's voice sharp with panic. Data breach, sir, it's bad. He'd slipped out of the hotel, glancing back at Ava's sleeping form, her dark hair spilled across the pillow. He'd scribbled the note in a rush, hating himself for it, but duty pulled him away. Her touch lingered like a melody I couldn't forget, he thought, staring out at the rain-streaked city. I left her, but I didn't want to. Back at the Driftwood Inn, Ava stepped into the lobby. The clerk giving her a knowing nod she ignored. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the morning light. She walked home, her shoes squishing with every step, the note crumpled in her pocket. She didn't know who Gray really was. Didn't know he was a man who commanded boardrooms and billions, a man hiding from his own life. All she knew was that she'd given herself to a stranger and now he was gone, a ghost who'd left her changed forever. As she unlocked her apartment door, she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the echo of him there. She'd find him again, she decided, or maybe he'd find her. Either way, that night had rewritten her, and there was no going back. Ava Bennett spent the next week in a haze, her mind replaying that night at the Driftwood Inn over and over. The Rainy Haven felt emptier without Gray, the bar counter a silent witness to their dance, their kiss, their reckless leap into the unknown. She went through her shifts on autopilot, pouring drinks with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her thoughts drifting to the man who'd vanished with nothing but a note. She checked the door every time it opened, hoping, but he never came back. Life moved on, the rain kept falling, and Ava tried to convince herself it was just a fleeting moment, a beautiful mistake she'd bury in time. Then, on a gray Monday morning, everything shifted. Ava sat at her tiny kitchen table, sketching absent-mindedly, when her phone buzzed with an email. The subject line read, "Interview invitation, Sullivan Tech." She frowned. She hadn't applied for anything, hadn't even heard of Sullivan Tech beyond vague mentions of some big tech company downtown. The email offered her a position as an assistant event coordinator, a job that promised better pay and a chance to use her creativity. It felt too good to be true, but curiosity won out. She pulled on her best dress, a simple navy thing she'd bought for a wedding years ago, and headed to the address listed, a sleek tower piercing the Seattle skyline. The lobby was all glass and steel, a world away from the worn wood of the Rainy Haven. Ava felt small, out of place, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor as she approached the reception desk. The woman behind it smiled tightly, handed her a visitor badge and directed her to the 35th floor. The elevator ride was silent, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls, a mix of nerves and determination in her brown eyes. She stepped out into a bustling office, people in suits moving with purpose, phones ringing, screens glowing. A young man in a crisp shirt led her to a conference room and told her to wait. She sat, smoothing her dress, when the door opened again. Ava looked up and her heart stopped. There he was, Gray, standing in a tailored suit that hugged his frame, his gray eyes widening for a split second before settling into a cool, unreadable mask. He wasn't the hoodie-clad stranger from the bar anymore. He was someone else entirely, someone who belonged here in this tower of power. He closed the door behind him, and the air thickened with silence. Ava stood, her voice barely a whisper. "You're here." He nodded, his tone clipped. "Grayson Sullivan, CEO. I'll be conducting your interview." Her mind spun. CEO? The man she'd danced with, kissed, given herself to, was the head of this empire? She sat back down, hands trembling in her lap as he took the chair across from her. He asked about her experience, her skills, his voice all business, but she caught the flicker in his gaze, the way it lingered on her lips before darting away. She answered mechanically, her thoughts a tangle of anger and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she wanted to ask, but the words stuck. The interview ended, and he offered her the job on the spot, effective tomorrow. She nodded, numb, and left without looking back. The next day, Ava started at Sullivan Tech, her desk a small island in a sea of corporate chaos. Grayson was everywhere and nowhere, leading meetings she glimpsed through glass walls, his presence a constant pull she couldn't escape. They worked together on an upcoming product launch, her planning the event, him approving every detail. He kept his distance, but there were moments. A brush of hands over a stack of papers, a shared glance across a crowded room, that sparked something undeniable. She hated it, hated him for pretending that night never happened, but she couldn't stop feeling him, the memory of his touch etched into her skin. One evening, after hours, she stayed late to finish a seating chart. The office was quiet, the city lights glittering through the windows. Grayson appeared, his tie loosened, a coffee cup in hand. He sat on the edge of her desk, too close, and the dam broke. "You act like we're strangers," she said, her voice shaking, "but I can still feel your hands on me. Who are you really?" He looked away, then back, his eyes dark with something raw. "You don't belong in my world, Ava," he said quietly. "But I can't stop wanting you in it." She stood, stepping closer, her breath hitching. "Then why did you leave? Why did you bring me here?" He didn't answer, not with words. He reached for her, his hand cupping her cheek, and for a moment she thought he'd kiss her again. But he pulled back, his jaw tight, and walked away, leaving her alone with the echo of his touch. Ava sank into her chair, her heart pounding. He was hiding something, she knew it, but she didn't know what, and she didn't know why she cared so much. Across the building, Grayson stood in his office, staring at the rain-streaked glass. He'd orchestrated this, pulled strings to get her the job, not out of pity, but because he couldn't let her go. That night at the bar had cracked something open in him. A man who'd spent years building walls around his heart. He'd left her at the hotel because duty demanded it, a crisis he couldn't ignore, but he'd regretted it every second since. She was a light he didn't deserve, a chance he couldn't take, not with his life tangled in secrets and expectations. Yet here she was, in his world, and he didn't know how to keep her out. Ava didn't know the truth, not yet. She didn't know that Grayson had watched her sleep that morning, memorizing her face before slipping away. She didn't know he'd written that note with a trembling hand, wishing he could stay, and she didn't know that every day since he'd fought the urge to find her again, until fate, or maybe his own quiet scheming, brought her back. They were strangers turned colleagues now, bound by a night neither could forget, and the tension between them was a thread pulling tighter with every passing moment. Back at her desk, Ava picked up her pencil, sketching his face from memory, the sharp jaw, the stormy eyes. She didn't understand why he'd hired her, why he looked at her like she was both a gift and a curse. But she felt it, the pull, the promise of something more. She'd given herself to him once, a stranger in the dark, and now he was here, no longer a shadow, but a man she couldn't stop wanting. Whatever he was hiding, she'd find out. Because Ava Bennett wasn't the kind of girl who let go easily, not when her heart was already in too deep. The days at Sullivan Tech blurred into weeks, and Ava Bennett found herself caught in a strange rhythm with Grayson Sullivan. Their work tethered them together. Planning the product launch became a dance of stolen glances and careful words. He was her boss, the CEO who commanded the room with a quiet authority, but he was also Gray, the man who'd held her under the dim lights of the rainy haven. She tried to keep him at arm's length, to focus on the job and not the way her skin tingled when he stood too close, but Grayson had other plans. It started small, a cup of coffee left on her desk one morning, black with a hint of cinnamon, just how she liked it. She caught his eye across the office, and he gave her a faint nod, no explanation, no fuss. Then came the late nights, when everyone else had gone home, and he'd linger, asking her opinion on things that didn't need asking, his voice softer than it was in meetings. Ava felt the walls she'd built crumbling, brick by brick, and she hated how much she wanted them to fall. He was a storm I shouldn't chase, she thought, but every time he's near, I forget how to run. One rainy evening, as the office emptied out, Grayson appeared at her desk with his coat in hand. "Walk with me," he said, not a question, but not quite a command. She hesitated, then grabbed her jacket, following him into the elevator. The silence between them was heavy, charged, until they stepped outside and the rain hit them like a curtain. He didn't open an umbrella, just tilted his head back and let the water soak him, a rare smile breaking through his usual mask. "Come on," he said, taking her hand, and they ran through the streets, laughing like kids, the city a blur of lights and wet pavement. They stopped under a bridge, breathless, water dripping from their hair. He looked at her then, really looked, and Ava felt her heart stutter. "You're different," he said, his voice low. "I've spent years hiding who I am, but with you, I don't want to." She asked what he meant, and he told her pieces of his truth, how he'd grown up with pressure to be perfect, how he'd sneak out to places like the rainy haven to feel normal. She listened, her hand still in his, and when he finished, she stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. For the first time, she saw the man behind the title, and it scared her how much she cared. After that, the distance between them shrank. He'd drive her home after late shifts, the radio playing softly as they talked about everything and nothing. He cooked for her once, a simple pasta dish in his sleek apartment, and she teased him about burning the sauce, her laughter filling the space. They kissed again, slow and deliberate, on his couch, and it felt like a promise, not a mistake. "You're the only thing that feels real in this chaos, Ava," he said, his hand cradling her face. "I'd give up everything just to hold you like this forever." She believed him, wanted to believe him, and for a while, it was enough. But the past doesn't stay buried. One afternoon, as Ava sorted invitations for the launch, a woman strode into the office, all sharp heels and sharper eyes. "Olivia Reed," she introduced herself, Grayson's fiancée. The word hit Ava like a punch, fiancé. Olivia's smile was cold, her handshake firm, and she spoke with a possessiveness that made Ava's stomach twist. "I've heard about you," she said, the new assistant. "Grayson's been so busy lately, hasn't he?" Ava nodded, mute, her mind racing. She looked at Grayson, standing across the room, his face unreadable, and felt a crack form in her chest. That night she confronted him in his office, the rain lashing the windows like it was angry too. "You're engaged?" she asked, her voice breaking. He didn't deny it, just ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "It's complicated, Ava. My family arranged it years ago, a business deal, not love. I don't want her, I want you." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "You should have told me. I gave you everything and you let me believe I was enough." He reached for her, but she stepped back, the hurt too raw. "I need time," she said, and left him standing there, the sound of her footsteps lost in the storm. The next day, Olivia cornered Ava in the break room, her tone dripping with venom. "You think you know him?" she said. "You're just a distraction, a little fling he'll toss aside when the novelty wears off. Stay away from him or I'll make sure you regret it." Ava held her ground, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I don't scare easy," she said, and walked away, but Olivia's words lingered, a poison seeping into her doubts. She didn't want to believe it, but what if it was true? What if she was just a moment to him, not a forever? Unknown to Ava, Olivia had more than words up her sleeve. She'd hired a private investigator after suspecting Grayson's distance, and the man had dug up gold. A grainy video from the Driftwood Inn's lobby camera showing Grayson and Ava stumbling in that night, hands entwined, clothes clinging to them from the rain. Olivia watched it on her phone, a smirk curling her lips. She'd save it for the right moment, a weapon to destroy them both if Grayson didn't fall in line. He was hers, she'd decided, and no barmaid was going to change that. Grayson, meanwhile, sat in his penthouse, the city sprawling below him, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. He'd let Ava walk away because she asked for space, but every fiber of him screamed to go after her. He'd never loved Olivia, never would, but the arrangement with her family kept Sullivan Tech stable, a leash he'd worn too long. Ava was different. She was freedom, a chance to be the man he wanted to be, not the one he'd been forced into. He'd messed up, keeping her in the dark, and now he risked losing her. "I can't let her go," he thought, "not when she's the only thing that keeps me breathing." Ava lay awake that night, the rain tapping her window like it was trying to talk to her. She replayed every moment with Grayson, the coffee, the walks, the way he'd looked at her like she was his whole world. She wanted to hate him, to erase him, but her heart wouldn't let her. He'd lied by omission, yes, but his touch, his words, they'd felt real. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache there, and whispered to the dark, "I'm falling for him, and I don't know how to stop." She didn't know about Olivia's video, didn't know the storm was about to get worse. All she knew was that Grayson Sullivan had taken her heart, and she wasn't sure she'd ever get it back. Across town, Grayson stood on his balcony, the rain soaking his shirt as he stared into the night. He'd find a way to fix this, to tell Ava everything, to choose her over the life he'd been chained to, because losing her wasn't an option, not now, not ever. The rain fell harder, a mirror to the chaos inside them both, and somewhere in that downpour their love grew, fragile but fierce, ready to face whatever came next. The rain hadn't stopped in Seattle, a relentless gray shroud over Ava Bennett's world as she sat at her desk in Sullivan Tech. The product launch was days away and the office buzzed with tension, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in the tangle of Grayson Sullivan and the shadow of Olivia Reed. She'd asked for time, and he'd given it, keeping their interactions strictly professional, but his presence still pulled at her, a quiet ache she wanted to trust him, to believe his words over Olivia's venom, but doubt gnawed at her, a whisper asking if she'd been a fool to fall so hard. Then the storm broke. It was late afternoon, the office half empty, when Ava's phone lit up with a notification, a news alert from a local tabloid. The headline screamed, "Sullivan Tech CEO caught in scandalous affair, video evidence leaked." Her stomach dropped as she tapped the link, and there it was, grainy but unmistakable footage from the Driftwood Inn's lobby camera. She saw herself, rain-soaked and laughing, her hand in Grayson's as they stumbled inside that night. The video cut to a still of them entering the elevator, his arm around her, her face turned up to his, a moment she'd held sacred now, splashed across the internet for the world to judge. Her hands shook as she scrolled, comments piling up, cruel and cutting. Barmaid seduces billionaire, another gold digger exposed. She felt sick, the air too thin, the room too loud. Colleagues glanced her way, whispers spreading like wildfire, and Ava bolted from her chair, grabbing her bag and fleeing to the stairwell. She sank against the wall, tears burning her eyes, the weight of it crushing her. It was as if the weight of I left him with everything I had, she thought, and he gave me a lie. Now I'm left with his child and my broken heart. She pressed a hand to her stomach. A secret she'd only just confirmed that morning, a faint line on a test she hadn't told anyone about. Across the building, Grayson Sullivan stared at his own screen, the video playing on loop in his office. His assistant had burst in minutes ago, pale and stammering, "Sir, it's everywhere." He watched himself with Ava, a night that had changed him, now twisted into a weapon. Olivia, he knew it instantly, her smirk from that break room confrontation flashing in his mind. He'd underestimated her, thought her threats were empty, but she'd struck with precision, aiming to ruin them both. He slammed his laptop shut, his fists clenched, rage and guilt warring inside him. I lost her because I couldn't let go of who I was, he thought. She was my everything, and I ruined it. He found Ava in the stairwell, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. "Ava," he said, his voice raw, "please, let me explain." She looked up, her eyes red, and stood, her voice cold. "Explain what? That you're engaged, that you let me walk into this blind? That night was mine, Grayson, and now it's trash for everyone to pick apart." He stepped closer, desperate. "Olivia did this, not me. I never wanted her, I told you that. This video, it's her revenge, because I chose you." Ava laughed, a bitter sound. "Chose me? You didn't choose me, you hid me. I was your secret, and now I'm your scandal." He reached for her, but she pulled away, her words cutting deeper. "I trusted you," she said. "I gave you everything, and you let her destroy me. I'm done." She turned, heading down the stairs, and he called after her. "Ava, please, I love you." She stopped, her back to him, and whispered, "Then why does it hurt so much?" Then she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her, leaving him alone with the echo of her pain. He sank to the floor, head in his hands, knowing he'd lost her, maybe for good. The next day, the scandal hit harder. Reporters camped outside Sullivan Tech, shareholders demanded answers, and Grayson faced a boardroom full of grim faces. Olivia sat at the far end, her expression smug, her family's influence a silent threat. He stood, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I take full responsibility," he said. "The woman in that video, she's not the mistake. This life, this lie, that's what I regret." I'm ending the engagement with Olivia Reed, effective immediately. Gasps filled the room, Olivia's face paling, but he didn't stop. "I'll step down if that's what it takes, but I won't let this destroy her." He left the meeting, ignoring the shouts, and drove to Ava's apartment, rain streaking his windshield. He knocked, but she didn't answer, her curtains drawn tight. He stood there, soaked and broken, and spoke to the door. "I'm sorry, Ava. I should have told you everything, should have fought for you sooner. I love you, and I'll fix this, I swear." He waited, hoping, but the silence was his only reply. Inside, Ava sat on her couch, tears falling as she heard him, her hand resting on her stomach. She wanted to open the door, to fall into him, but the hurt held her back. She didn't know if she could trust him again. Not yet. That night, Grayson went live on television, a last-ditch effort to reach her. The studio lights glared, but he looked straight into the camera, his voice calm. "I've made mistakes," he said. "I hurt someone I love, and I let her pay for it. Ava Bennett isn't what they're saying. She's honest, brave, better than I'll ever be. I'm stepping away from Sullivan Tech to fix what I broke, to be the man she deserves. If you're watching, Ava, I'm sorry, and I'll wait for you, as long as it takes." He walked off, leaving the anchor stunned, the feed cutting to black. Ava watched from her apartment, the screen flickering in the dark. Her heart twisted, his words sinking in, but the wound was still fresh. She turned off the TV, curling into herself, the rain a steady drum outside. She didn't know he'd given up everything. Didn't know she carried his child, a secret she guarded like a fragile flame. She only knew she loved him, and it wasn't enough. Not now. "I gave him my heart," she thought, "and he shattered it under the spotlight. I need to protect what's left. For me, for us." Grayson stood outside her building, rain pooling at his feet, staring up at her window. He'd lost his company, his reputation, his fiancée, but none of it mattered if he'd lost her. He'd fight for her, he vowed, even if it took years, even if she never forgave him, because Ava Bennett wasn't just a knight, she was his life, and he'd do anything to prove it. The rain fell harder, washing away the man he'd been, leaving only the one who loved her, broken but determined, waiting in the dark. The rain didn't let up in Seattle, a constant companion to Ava Bennett as she sat in her dim apartment, the echoes of Grayson Sullivan's televised apology still ringing in her ears. She'd watched him bare his soul to the world, give up his empire, all for her. And it stirred something deep inside, a flicker of hope she'd tried to bury. But the hurt lingered, sharp and heavy, keeping her locked behind her door, away from him. She rested a hand on her stomach, feeling the secret growing there, a child she hadn't told him about. She wanted to forgive him, to run to him, but trust was a fragile thing, and hers was still in pieces. Days passed, and the city buzzed with the fallout of Grayson's decision. Sullivan Tech announced a new interim CEO, Olivia Reed vanished from the headlines, and the scandal began to fade, replaced by whispers of his sacrifice. Ava went back to the rainy haven, pouring drinks with a quiet resolve, her co-workers tiptoeing around her with pitying looks. She hated it, hated being the girl from the video, but she held her head high, determined to rebuild herself. Yet every night as she locked up, she felt him, a ghost in the rain, waiting for her to turn around. Grayson didn't give up. He'd moved out of his penthouse, traded his suits for jeans, and taken a small apartment near the water, a simple life he'd always craved. He'd walk past the rainy haven some nights, not to bother her, just to see her silhouette through the window, a reminder of what he was fighting for. He sent her letters, handwritten and slipped under her door, words of regret and love she read in secret, her fingers tracing his messy scrawl. "I don't need power or wealth, Ava," one read. "I need you, my rain, my home." She kept them in a drawer, a growing stack she couldn't throw away. One evening, as the bar closed, Ava stepped outside, umbrella in hand, and there he was, standing across the street, rain soaking his jacket. He didn't move, just watched her, his gray eyes steady and pleading. She froze, her heart thudding, and against her better judgment she crossed to him. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, water dripping from his hair. "Because I can't stop," he said. "I love you, Ava, and I'll stand in this rain forever if that's what it takes to prove it." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man she'd fallen for, stripped of titles and lies, raw and real. "What about Olivia?" she asked. "What about your company?" He shook his head. "Olivia's gone. The engagement was a cage I broke free from. The company doesn't matter. I walked away." "You're what matters." His voice cracked and he reached for her hand, tentative. "I should have told you everything from the start. That night wasn't a mistake. It was the moment I found you. I'm begging you, give me a chance to make it right." Ava's breath caught, the rain blurring her vision. Or maybe it was tears. She wanted to push him away, to protect herself, but his words sank into her, filling the cracks he'd left. She thought of the letters, the TV broadcast, the way he'd stood outside her building that night, soaked and desperate, and she thought of their child, a piece of him she couldn't deny. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared you'll break me again." He squeezed her hand, his voice soft but firm. "I won't. I swear I won't." She didn't answer with words. She stepped into him, letting her umbrella fall, and he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. The rain drenched them both, cold and unrelenting, but his warmth seeped into her, thawing the ice she'd built. He kissed her forehead, then her lips, slow and tender, a promise sealed in the downpour. "I thought I'd lost him forever," she thought, "but here he is, rewriting my ending with every word." They stood there, holding each other, the world fading away, just two people finding their way back. Later in her apartment, they sat on her couch, towels draped over their shoulders, coffee steaming between them. Ava took a deep breath, her hand finding his. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice steady. "I'm pregnant." Grayson froze, his eyes widening, then softening as the words sank in. "Pregnant?" he repeated, a smile breaking through. "You mean we're having a baby?" She nodded and he laughed, a sound so pure it melted the last of her walls. He pulled her into his lap, kissing her fiercely. "I'm going to be a father and you're going to be mine forever if you'll have me." She smiled, tears mixing with her laughter. "Forever's a long time, Gray." He grinned, brushing her hair back. "Not long enough with you." Then he slid off the couch, kneeling in front of her, his hands on hers. "Marry me, Ava. Not because of the baby, not because of anything else, but because I love you and I want every day with you." She stared at him, her heart full, and nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, because I love you too." They kissed again, a vow in the quiet, the rain a gentle hum outside. Weeks later, they stood on a windswept beach along the Oregon coast, a small crowd of friends and family gathered around. Ava wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, a faint curve to her belly just starting to show. Grayson, in a linen shirt and jeans, couldn't take his eyes off her as they exchanged rings, the ocean crashing behind them. "I promise to love you through every storm," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise to trust you, to build this life with you," she replied, her hand in his. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and he kissed her, deep and sure, the rain starting again as if to bless them. Grayson didn't know about the baby that first night, didn't know how one reckless moment would lead to this, a family, a future. He'd given up everything he'd been to become the man she needed, and he'd never regretted it. Ava looked at him as they danced on the sand, barefoot and laughing, and felt peace settle over her. She'd been scared to love him, scared to lose him, but here they were, stronger for it. The rain fell soft and steady, washing away the past, leaving only the love they'd fought for. Back in Seattle, the rainy haven stood quiet that night, the bar empty but warm with memories. Ava and Grayson had found each other there, lost themselves in the heat of a moment, and come out the other side whole. She didn't need to work there anymore, didn't need to pour drinks to feel alive, because he'd given her that, a life worth living, a love worth the rain. And as they drove away from the coast, hand in hand, the city lights fading behind them, they knew this was just the beginning, a story written in water and heartbeats. Theirs, forever. The rain fell gently over Seattle, a familiar song as Ava Bennett, now Ava Sullivan, stood in the doorway of her new home, a cozy house by the water. 2 years had passed since that night at the Rainy Haven, since the chaos and the love that followed, and life had settled into something beautiful. She watched Grayson Sullivan chase their daughter Mia across the small yard, her tiny legs wobbling as she giggled, raindrops catching in her dark curls. At 18 months, Mia was a burst of light, a perfect blend of them both, with Ava's smile and Grayson's stormy gray eyes. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and fresh paint, a canvas of their new beginning. Grayson had stepped away from Sullivan Tech completely, taking on freelance consulting work he could do from home, trading boardrooms for quiet mornings with his family. Ava had opened a small cafe near the waterfront, the Haven Brew, a nod to where it all started. She served coffee and pastries, her sketches framed on the walls, a dream she'd once buried, now alive and thriving. They'd built this life together piece by piece, a testament to what they'd overcome. Grayson scooped Mia up, spinning her until she squealed, then carried her to Ava, his grin wide and unguarded. He kissed Ava's forehead, a habit he'd never lost, and she leaned into him, her hand resting on Mia's back. "You're soaked," she teased, and he laughed. "I'm used to it by now." They stepped inside, Mia babbling about the rain as Grayson set her down to toddle toward her toys. Ava watched him, her heart full, marveling at how far they'd come. "That rainy night took everything I knew and gave me everything I needed," she thought. "A love stronger than any storm." Later, as Mia napped, they sat on the couch, a blanket draped over their legs, the sound of rain tapping the roof. Grayson pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, meaning the company, the power, the life he'd left behind. He shook his head, his voice soft. "Not for a second. This, you and Mia, it's more than I ever dreamed of." She smiled, tracing his hand with her fingers. "I didn't think I'd find this either," she said. "I thought I'd lost you, but you stayed." He tilted her chin up, his eyes locking with hers. "I'll always stay," he said. "You're my heart, Ava, and Mia's my soul. I'd trade 1,000 empires for this." He kissed her then, slow and deep, a quiet promise in the warmth of their home. She melted into him, feeling the truth of his words, the weight of their journey settling into peace. They'd faced scandals, secrets, and storms, but here they were, a family forged in rain and love, unbreakable. That evening, they took Mia to the Haven Brew, a ritual they loved. The cafe was quiet, a few regulars sipping coffee as Ava adjusted a frame on the wall, a sketch of Grayson and Mia laughing in the yard. Grayson played with Mia at a corner table, building a tower of sugar packets she promptly knocked over, her giggles filling the space. A customer, an older woman, smiled at them. "You've got a beautiful family," she said, and Ava nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, we do." As they locked up, the rain picked up again, a soft drizzle that painted the city in silver. Grayson lifted Mia onto his shoulders, and Ava slipped her hand into his, their fingers lacing together. They walked home, the streets quiet, the world theirs. Ava looked at her husband, her daughter, and felt a gratitude so deep it ached. She'd given herself to a stranger that night, a man she didn't know, and he'd turned out to be her everything. Grayson glanced at her, catching her stare, and squeezed her hand. "What?" he asked, smiling. "Just you," she said, "just us." Back home, they tucked Mia into bed, her tiny hand clutching a stuffed rabbit, the rain a lullaby outside her window. Ava and Grayson stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, then turned to each other, their smiles mirroring a shared joy. This was their life now. Simple, messy, perfect. The rain fell on, a constant thread through their story, and as they climbed into bed, Ava whispered, "I love you, Gray." He pulled her close, his voice a murmur against her hair. "I love you too, always." And in that moment, they knew no storm could ever take this away.